Hi everyone, Aditya here. Welcome to my channel. So today we are going to continue our comprehensive AWS course, and in that already covered synchronous and asynchronous way of calling Lambda, right? Invoking Lambda. So we have already seen how to use a schedule and how to use an S3 event notifications to synchronously call Lambda. Now what we are going to do is we are going to see one more way to call the Lambda, that is event source mapping, right? Here, if you see the name, the event source mapping, that means we are going to map the source events to the Lambda. So we will see what is this event source mapping. So this is another way of processing events from the source, okay? And in this case of any events in source, Lambda needs to poll the source for events. So earlier what happened from the S3 event notification, any events in S3 only invoke the Lambda, right? But even though in schedule also, for every 1 minute we are invoking the Lambda. But here Lambda will monitor the source for any events. So how can we achieve that? We will we will configure the Lambda in such a way that it will poll the source for events. Okay. In this case, the Lambda has to be invoked synchronously. And yeah, so this is a synchronous invocation. So this is synchronous invocation because we are configuring Lambda to get the events, and after that processing events, we have any failures we need to send back to the response. That's why it is called synchronous invocation, and we are using event source mapping to invoke Lambda for any events, right? Any events in the source. Here the source may be SQS or DynamoDB data streams or Kinesis data streams. Okay, so in these three sources, right, if any events happened, Lambda is going to be invoked synchronously. So for that purpose, we will use event source mapping. Okay, so in this session, we are going to cover SQS, and don't worry about DynamoDB data streams and Kinesis data streams. We will cover those in the further sessions. Now, when it comes to SQS, right, we have few things I need to cover here. So earlier for S3 event notifications, we configured S3 to send event into the Lambda. But now here we need to configure Lambda to poll the source. So this thing we have already discussed. Here Lambda is the responsible to get the information from the source. Events, right? Earlier S3 is responsible for send events to the Lambda. Okay, that is the key difference. And in this session, we are going to concentrate on SQS and Lambda event source mapping, right? So SQS and Lambda event source mapping, or SQS and Lambda integration, anything is fine. So we are concentrating on SQS. Okay, and we know that SQS two variants, right? That is standard SQS and another one is FIFO SQS. Sorry, here there was some typo. We have standard SQS and FIFO SQS as two variants. So standard one is a normal one which will store the messages, and we can pick any messages, right? Any messages simultaneously. But when it comes to FIFO SQS, the first in first out order will be strictly followed. So the first inserted element only first sent out. Okay. And how we achieve parallelism? In standard queue, we can easily achieve parallelism because each consumer, if you add 20 consumers to SQS, each consumer pick different messages. But when it comes to SQS, we need to ensure we have different message groups. So if you have different message group, each consumer will process different message group, and so that inside message group we will process elements or messages one by one, first in first out order. Okay, so to ensure the feature, right, or the quality, the first in first out feature, we are using the FIFO SQS, right? Based on your use case, you can use. Here we have two variants, that is standard SQS, another one is FIFO SQS, right? This is a typo. I need to add it as a bullet point, but somehow it's came it as a number. Okay. So let's see the flow of event source mapping in SQS and Lambda. Okay. Now let's try to understand Lambda and event source mapping, how it works with SQS, right? For that, we need SQS. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take SQS. So this is our SQS service. SQS2 has two variants, but I am creating this as a common thing. So you just see this flow. So from the SQS, right? From the SQS, any events happen in SQS, we need to configure Lambda to monitor the SQS events and do the processing. So for that, we need to see inside the Lambda environment, right? Earlier we just called the Lambda function, but we haven't seen what is happening inside the Lambda because we haven't configured anything inside Lambda. But now we are going to configure few things in this Lambda environment. So for that, I'm going to search for the Lambda symbols here. So this one I am using, and this whole box, right? This whole box represents the Lambda environment. Okay. Now here inside the Lambda environment, what we are going to do is we are going to configure event source mapping. So event source mapping is nothing but it's a queue, which is by default there in Lambda environment. So we can set up that event source mapping like this. Okay. So this is our event source mapper. So we name it as event queue or event source mapper, anything fine. So I am going to name it as event queue or event source mapper. Okay. It's your convenient and you can use any name. So I am named it as event source mapper. Now from the Lambda, we need to monitor any events in SQS. So what we're going to do is we're going to poll. So whenever we're getting messages from streams or queues, right? The fetching of the records, which will be called as polling. So we need to poll for messages. So that thing who will take care? The event source mapper will take care of polling messages from the queue. So I am going to name it as polling messages. Okay. So this is like polling messages. Once event source mapper polls messages to the SQS queue, then SQS queue will return back the response like this. Okay. So S, SQS queue will return back the response. Fine, right? And you need to know what is the response now. So the response could be the batch, right? It will send a batch of records. So a batch of messages in case of queue. Okay. So whenever event source mapper configured to monitor the SQS and it will do polling, and whenever it is doing polling, right, it will get messages in a batch, right? And now what is the work of event source mapper or event queue is it will invoke the Lambda function now. Okay. So we need a Lambda function. So I'm going to take our Lambda function, and this Lambda function could be invoked by our event source mapper like this. Okay, so this is our Lambda. So I would call it as Lambda function because to differentiate between the Lambda environment and function. So whenever you create a Lambda function, you can set up its environment like this. So you can configure it to use the event source or event queue to poll some source. So here you can set up SQS like this. Okay, and here what is the input to this Lambda is nothing but this batch of messages only. So it will invoke Lambda with this batch of messages. Okay, like this we can use Lambda to integrate with SQS and monitor its events, right? Any events and send those events in batches to the event source mapper, and event source mapper is responsible for sending for processing to Lambda function, right? So this is the way of invoking Lambda synchronously using SQS, right? Using event source mapper as an intermediate step. Okay, so we will move on to the next slide. So now we have already seen this thing, right? We have an SQS queue uh, which will have some events, and we will configure the Lambda environment, right? We have event source mapping which will pull the messages from the SQS, and those messages we will get as batches. Once those messages received by the event queue or event source mapping, it will send that batch to Lambda for further processing. And we need to see a few more things about this event source mapping. Those are, as we know, Lambda event source queue or mapping will poll SQS for messages. And one thing to note here is Lambda is using long polling. So I think you are familiar with long polling, right? Whenever it's a queue, if we enable the long polling, it will wait until we get some messages into the queue. So that is the use of long polling. So what is a normal polling? Normal poll, it will check for the message. If no message is there, it will return back to the consumer, right? But long polling will wait for the message to arrive. So that is the use of long polling. And we know that Lambda return batch of messages back to the event queue or source mapping, right? It will return the batch of messages. Sorry, here is a typo. It should be SQS, right? SQS could return the batch of messages to event queue or source mapping, right? And we can configure the batch size also. So there, how many batch, right? Each batch should have how many records we can configure, right? Configure that. So if we need 10 batches, we can configure 10 items in a batch. We can configure that in the Lambda environment. So here it's a typo. It should be SQS. So SQS return back the messages, right? SQS return batch of messages back to the event queue. So if SQS send back those batch of messages to event queue, we need our configure, right? Source mapping, then we need to configure that batch. So how many records should be inside that batch we can configure in Lambda environment. And the next one is a recommended practice from the AWS. That is, it suggests to set SQS the visibility timeout the 6 times more than the Lambda timeout, right? We know the Lambda hot timeout, no, it's 15 minutes. So Lambda usually dies after 15 minutes. So we have to use an visibility timeout. So we have in SQS, we have an visibility timeout settings. So that settings we have to set up to 6 times of Lambda timeout. That is 6 into 15. Okay, so that is doable. So we can do on the console of SQS. Okay, and the next thing is for failures, right? If we have any failures in the Lambda processing, so since we know we'll get a batch of messages to process, any issue in one batch, right? One message in a batch, the whole batch should be marked as failed. Okay, so we need to set up some other processing or other persistent area to store those failed things, right? Here, one more thing you need to consider is Lambda won't retry because it's a synchronous invocation. So since it's a synchronous invocation, what we have to do is we have to set up a dead letter queue, and that dead letter queue will store the failed events. So if one event inside the batch fails, that whole batch marked as a failed thing, and that batch has been stored in some dead letter queue. And we know that we can set up dead letter queue in the both Lambda and SQS also. But here we need to set the dead letter queue on SQS because Lambda we're invoking synchronously. So for synchronous invocation, two things we need to remember. One thing is retries. The retry is not possible. And another thing is TLQ is also not possible. Okay, only asynchronous invocations in Lambda, we can set up these two things, DLQ and retries. But synchronous invocation, we need to make sure of error handling. So on the side of SQS, you need to set up your DLQ. Okay, not in Lambda. So these are the few things we need to know about event source mapping. Now we will see the differences between SQS versus FIFO SQS, right? Here SQS is standard simple queuing service and FIFO SQS is first in first out simple queuing service. Now we'll see. So we'll see the standard, right? SQS standard. So in SQS standard, the messages inside the SQS queue may not be processed in order, right? So I have 10 consumers, 10 consumers will get different 10 messages. Okay, so if you had parallelism. So because of that, so the scaling of Lambda will be quicker, and it will take all the messages, it will create those many instances. So if you have 60 messages in SQS, in a minute itself it will add 60 more instances of Lambda to execute each and every message because it is not processed in order. So the parallelism is very good here. And the maximum batch size could be 1000. So that means in a particular batch, we know SQS will send back a batch of messages to the event source queue or event mapping, and that batch should contain maximum 1000 messages, and those 1000 messages we can process asynchronously here because this is a standard queue. And if we look at the SQS FIFO, that is not a standard one. This is first in first out, so which will strictly follows the first in first out rule, right? The messages in FIFO, the first in first out, will be processed in order. So will be processed in order. Lambda scaling depends on the message group. So here, how can we achieve parallelism or asynchronous way of executing these messages inside the SQS is based on the groups. Since we can't execute each and every message asynchronously because the concept of SQS FIFO is first in first out. So will be processed in order, right? So one by one. That is called in order. So here the lambda scaling depends on the message group. So even though you want parallelism on this in order processing, you will group your messages into different message groups, and each group you will process synchronously. And inside that group, each message will be processed in order. So that is the concept, right? So if you want to add parallelism, otherwise each message will be processed one by one in order. So here it will scale up to 10 instances if you have 10 message groups. So each message group has maybe 1000 or 2000 messages, but each message inside that message group will be processed in order. That is the difference between the SQS standard and SQS FIFO, right? And now we'll see some common features. So whenever Lambda process the message, right, one message is processed inside the batch, and that message will be deleted from the queue in both standard and FIFO. And one more thing you need to note is there will be a good amount of chance the same item can be processed two times. So there will be a chance. So in that case, we need to make sure our Lambda will not process the same item twice. So we need to ensure that idempotent nature of the Lambda. And we'll see the error handling. Now how to handle errors here, right? The event source mapping, we are calling Lambda synchronously, right? So remember that we are calling synchronously. You can't set up retrace. You can't set up dead letter queue on Lambda state. So those two things we have to remember because it's a synchronous invocation. In case of any errors, Lambda will return failed batch back to the queue. Okay, queue stores these messages in a different grouping ID and Lambda will process this later. So since we return back the batch of messages to the queue, so in order to process them, right? In order to process these failed items, since we are executing everything based on grouping IDs, right? Grouping, we will group messages, right? We can do that. So using that different group ID, it will create a different group ID, and using that group ID again read those records and process them later. And here you can see it will store, it is in a different group ID, right? And how queue stores this failed batch of messages. So this different group ID should be stored in the same queue? No. So it will be stored in DL queue. So this DL queue is a dead letter queue. We can set up on SQS, not on Lambda. Okay. We need to configure this DL queue on SQS to store failed batch. So once everything completes, this DL queue will push back the messages to the queue with different grouping ID. It will create its own grouping ID. And again, the consumer, right, our Lambda will listen to this or will monitor to this queue and pull the messages and get this grouping ID batch and again process the messages for failures which are failed earlier. We have seen enough part of theory. Now we'll try to do hands-on. So for that, we need two things, right? We need Lambda and also we need SQS. So I'm creating. So two things, right? We need a Lambda and we need a queue. Okay, I have this test queue. I'm going to delete this queue. Yep. So I'm not using any queue, right? I don't have any queues. I don't have any Lambdas. Now first thing we need to configure our Lambda function. So for that I'm creating a Lambda. So create function page will be API. I think you know this pretty much. So I'm starting from the other from scratch and giving my Lambda name is Lambda SQS. And the runtime I'm going to use Python 3.12 and the remaining thing I am keeping it same and creating the function. And before creating this function, right, one thing we need to make sure this execution role. You need to attach some policy, right? Since this execution role don't have access to the SQS, it may fail. But we will see now what happens. So I'm going with the basic Lambda permissions and will create the Lambda. Okay, so I'm going to create the Lambda function by clicking on this button, create function. Now it's loading. It will take some time to create our Lambda function. Mhm. It's taking good amount of time. Yep. So Lambda function has been successfully created. Very good. So this is our Lambda function. Now we'll do one thing. First we'll go to code and we'll change few things, right? So usually we have event, right? We'll print the event. So we'll do the same thing, print event. That's it. And reply the new changes. So the new changes is updating. So this queue is ready with new changes. Yeah, that's it. That's it. Pretty much we are not going to change anything. Now we have Lambda. We have set up it, right? Now what we are going to do is we need to add its source. So we need to add some source so that the source will trigger the Lambda. So that is nothing but add trigger. So here you have an option, right? Click on this add trigger. So once you clicked on this add trigger, you will get this page opened. So just look at this page. It is loading now. Let us wait for some time. Let it load. Okay. Yeah, it's asking to select source. So if I click on this drop down, you will get n number of options, right? Like from DynamoDB, DB2, SQS, SNS, S3, Event Bridge, even some third-party integrations like Glady, Game Server, iLet, Cloudless, MongoDB, right? You can integrate with all these things, right? You can add them, any of them as your trigger to your Lambda. For as of now, since we are going with SQS, I'm selecting the SQS. So once I selected the SQS, it is asking me to add SQS ARN or SQS queue to select here. So for that I need to check. And if you see here, no items has been added here. So that means we don't have any queues available. So for that I'm going to create a queue. So I came to our queue service, and I'm going to create a queue. So click on this create queue. It will show this page, right? You can create standard queue or FIFO queue. As of now, I'm going with standard queue. I think you pretty much know about the differences between the standard and FIFO queues, right? No, I'm going to name it as Lambda queue, right? Since we are using queue and Lambda integration. And visibility timeout, we can set whatever value you want, and message retention period. These are all options you can explore later, right? And remaining things I'm keeping at the same. We are not changing anything, so we'll keep at the same, right? We are not setting that letter queue. No also. So it's just a demo, right? So I'm going to click on the create queue. What we did, we have given name. That's it. We created a queue. It's a standard queue. That's a simple standard queue. Now we'll go to the Lambda, right? Here we are going to add the queue now. Now we'll check whether queue will come here or not by clicking this refresh button and check. Yep, the queue has been added. So now I am going to select this queue. Now this ARN added as a trigger, right? This SQS. And you can add your batch size. You can add your batch size. As of now, I'm giving it 10. And you can add your batch window, right? Batch size, we have already discussed the number of records in each batch, right? You can control it. And you can report item failures. This and all you can leave it as of now for this demo. We are going to activate this trigger. That's it, right? And click on this add button. Now you are getting the actual error, right? An error occurred when creating the trigger. The provided execution role does not have permissions to call receive messages on SQS. So you have to remember this. You don't your execution role don't have permissions. So for that you need to check now, right? So if I go back, right, it will fail. I mean, this thing we have to do again. So for that, I'm going to open this Lambda in new tab, and what I am going to do is I'm going to our functions, open the function, right? First, I'm going to change the execution role. So for that, once you open our Lambda function, we need to go to configuration section. Inside configuration section, if you see, we have only two options, right? You can able to allow to create logs and to create log streams and put log streams. So you have to change this role. This is the your execution role. So we can go to this roles and it will navigate to IAM console. Here, I think you can add your own policy. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to attach a policy which is already available for SQS and Lambda integration. That is this one. AWS, we have so many things, right? You can give Amazon SQS full access also, but it's better to give this execution role for the Lambda and SQS, right? Lambda will execute some things on SQS. So I'm clicking that and add permission. So the new permission has been added here. And now if I come back to our, I need to come back to our Lambda, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to Lambda. So here I will type Lambda. So I come back to our Lambda. So this is Lambda SQS. And if I will go to the configuration, we'll check it's reflecting or not. And here if you see, right, we have these two things earlier, and also you may have different role execution, right? Yeah. So here, right, you have the log put event. Sorry, in the resource also you can see this is the new thing added, that is Lambda SQS. So you can create a log stream and you can put log events. Okay. So like this we can integrate, give the execution role permission to write to SQS. Now the SQS is also ready, right? The SQS is also ready now. Since we don't have any permissions, this was failed earlier. Now we are going to add again, and boom, it has been added as a trigger. So we have set our SQS as a trigger to our Lambda service, right? Now since Lambda is listening to this SQS, so that event source mapping, as we discussed, no, that been happened inside. We don't need to configure it by default anything. So it will be configured by default when you add trigger to this SQS or Kinesis data stream or DynamoDB data streams. Okay, so we'll check how it works, right? Since Lambda will invoke whenever an event happen in SQS, we'll try to add an event in SQS. So I'm going to my queue and I'm going to send a message. Click on the send and receive messages. I'm going to send my message Aditya, and you can add some attributes also, right? Aditya. So my name as Aditya. This is the value, right? And yeah, that's it. Send message. We are sending the message to queue. Okay. So here in the below, you can receive the messages, right? So we'll see. Since we have sent a messages to the queue, we'll see whether our Lambda function invoked or not. I'm going back to my Lambda, and here I'm going to my monitor section because all the logs has been monitored here, and I'm going to check for any recent invocations. Since we invoke the since we added a message here, we'll see whether Lambda invoked or not. So we'll wait for few minutes to get the log string created. So we'll do one thing. We'll go to our this thing. This view in CloudWatch logs option will be there. It will show quickly, right? Sometimes recent invocation will take time to load. We'll directly go to CloudWatch, and yeah, here we have one stream, right? I'm opening the stream, and here you can able to see there was some invocation. And if I open this inside, you can able to see, right? This is all the attributes, so you can ignore. No, you can see the body Aditya and the attributes which we have given. No, we'll see is there anything. Yeah, name, name which is of string type Aditya. So like this, you can trigger. You can poll for events, right? You poll for events in SQS and process inside your Lambda function. Even you can set up your Kinesis data streams, DynamoDB data streams like this only. And it has some other ways, other additional options and additional things, right? Because those concept is different than SQS. So we'll discuss them later. And as of now, this is our hands-on. I hope you like this video. If you like my content, please do support me, like, share, and subscribe. And let me know if you want to learn any new concepts. I will try to incorporate in my sessions. And thanks for watching my video. Bye.